There's a new book out that's completely reframing how we look at far-right terrorism in the US. And it makes a pretty bold claim that to understand what's happening now, you have to look way, way back into the past. So in this explainer, we're going to dive into the key arguments from God, Guns, and Sedition. The attack on the US Capitol on January 6th, it felt like it came out of nowhere, right? A shocking, one-off event. But what if it wasn't? The authors of this book argue that what we saw that day was actually the final act of a long-term strategy, a deliberate plan that's been in the works since the early 1980s. You hear a quote like that captured right in the middle of all the chaos, and it sounds like a spontaneous cry. But according to the book, it's so much more than that. It's actually the echo of a call to action that's been building for decades, a revolutionary idea that was basically hiding in plain sight, just waiting for a moment like this. So that brings us to the first huge idea from the book, this decades-old battle plan. The core argument is that the far-right violence we're seeing today isn't some new thing. No, it's the modern-day execution of a very specific plan, one that was carefully put together by the movement's pioneers almost 40 years ago. And this is the part you really have to get. This was never about scattered groups or isolated protests. The book argues this was about creating a coherent, long-term strategy for actual revolution. It documents how each flashpoint, each act of violence over the years, was really part of this much larger plan. Okay, so what is this strategy exactly? Well, at its very heart is a concept called accelerationism, and you really need to understand this term to get what's happening today. Accelerationism. I mean, it sounds intense, right? And it is. It's a truly revolutionary ideology. The belief is that the modern democratic state is so broken, so corrupt, that you can't fix it. You can only demolish it. And what's the best tool for demolition? Chaos. The entire goal is to stir up so much conflict and division that the whole system just collapses on itself. And this isn't just a vague idea. There's a clear three-step playbook. Step 1, create chaos through targeted violent attacks. Step 2, bait the government into a massive, heavy-handed response, which you can then point to as tyranny. And finally, step 3, use that backlash to light the fuse on a full-blown civil war. And look, this isn't just some academic theory. The attackers themselves say it out loud. Before his attack, John Earnest basically spelled out the whole accelerationist plan. Commit violence to provoke the government into taking away guns, which he hoped would be the trigger for civil war. It's all right there. So you have to be asking, where did this insane playbook even come from? Well, the book traces a lot of the ideological DNA back to a single and pretty notorious work of fiction from the 1970s. Yeah, a novel. It's called The Turner Diaries, and you have to understand, for these groups, it's not just a story. It's treated like an operational manual for a race war. It lays out a whole fictional campaign of terror from assassinations to, and this is chilling, a truck bombing of the FBI headquarters. It literally provided a blueprint that real-world extremists would try to follow for decades. And this brings us right back to January 6th. That gallows they built outside the Capitol, that wasn't just some random, scary prop. The book explains it's a direct reference to something in the novel called The Day of the Rope, a fantasy of mass public hangings of anyone considered a race traitor. It's just a terrifying link between the fiction of 1978 and the reality of 2021. The book then connects the dots through these major historical moments. You have the Order in the 80s, who literally tried to act out the novel's plot. Then you get Ruby Ridge and Waco, which became huge rallying cries against so-called federal tyranny, and all of that leads directly to Timothy McVeigh, who took the novel's fictional bombing and turned it into a horrific, deadly reality. Okay, so that brings us to the modern era, where this threat has evolved into something global. Now, the core battle plan, that has stayed remarkably consistent, but the tools being used to carry it out, well, they've changed everything. One of the most important concepts the book points to for our time is this idea of ideological convergence. What that means is that all these distinct, hateful ideologies that used to kind of stay in their own lanes, well, they're not separate anymore. They're all merging and feeding off each other, creating something way more dangerous. So you end up with this toxic stew, this combustible mix of white supremacism, intense hostility to government, racism, anti-Semitism, and just these vast, sprawling conspiracy theories. It all gets blended together, which creates a bigger tent that can appeal to way more people under the single revolutionary banner. And what's poured gasoline on this fire? Technology. I mean, think about it. The movement's founders were relying on mail order books and these clunky, early computer bulletin boards. Today, it's encrypted apps, social media platforms, and the ability to live stream an attack to a global audience in real time. And the result of all that is that the line between domestic and international terrorism, it's pretty much gone. An attacker in Christchurch, New Zealand, can use a live stream to directly inspire someone in Poway, California, who then inspires someone else in Europe. It's become a truly globalized movement. So why does digging into all this 40-year-old history actually matter now? Well, the book makes a really powerful case that if we have any hope of actually countering this threat, we first have to understand its deep roots and the strategic thinking behind it. The book argues that we have to focus our efforts on what it calls the movement's centers of gravity, its core strengths and vulnerabilities. That means directly confronting the conspiratorial mindset, disrupting how social media is used to radicalize people, pushing back when extremist ideas creep into mainstream politics, and addressing recruitment inside the military and law enforcement. And this brings us to the ultimate trap. This kind of terrorism is a strategy of provocation. The goal isn't necessarily to win on a battlefield. The book warns that the real victory for the terrorists comes when a government overreacts, when it plays right into their hands and starts eroding democratic values all on its own. Which leaves us with the essential, vital question this whole history forces us to ask. If the entire point of this violence is to bait a democracy into destroying itself, how does that democracy fight back effectively without becoming the very tyranny the terrorists want it to be? That right there, that's the challenge of our time.